So, good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. I want to thank you for hanging in there with us. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. And we have a special honored guest with us, Penelope Green, who is an obituaries writer at the New York Times, who very graciously agreed to sit for an interview this morning, which is remarkable because, to the best of my knowledge, writers on the obituaries desk, as a general rule, don't give interviews and don't speak to community groups. So we're very fortunate to have Penelope with us. Before our interview begins, there are a couple points I wanted to touch on just briefly. I wanted to say that this program is a co-production with the Philadelphia nonprofit Penn's Village. Penn's Village exists to help Philadelphia seniors stay in the homes and neighborhoods that they love. And for more information about what the people at Penn's Village do and how you can help, please Google them. Secondly, after Penelope and I have had a chance to chat, you, our audience, will certainly have a chance to ask her questions as well. So a quick reminder, you can send a question to Penelope at any point during the program this morning. Just look for the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That's where you would go to type questions for her. She's happy to respond to your questions and will at the end of our interview this morning. And now, here are some things you should know about our guest. She is a native of Washington, D.C. She grew up in Manhattan. She has more than 30 years of experience as both a feature writer and an editor at the New York Times. When she was in feature writing mode, she had some pretty interesting adventures, including visiting a commune that nobody joined, and at least briefly residing in what has to be the smallest apartment that was ever constructed in Manhattan. It's enough to give somebody pause. So with that cursory introduction behind us, I'd like to just jump in and get started. So Penelope, I wanted to ask you, what are the characteristics or the elements that separate a great obituary from one that is just okay?
Well, first I want to say hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I don't know that it's the case that obituaries writers say no to interviews. I think we say yes to everyone. And I think just ask. So I just wanted to put that out there that my colleagues are gung-ho to talk about the craft that they love so much. Because all obituaries writers, at least those on my desk, are passionate about what they do. Anyway, all that said, what makes an obit sing is flair. And I took some pieces of some really stellar obits, and I'd like to read some of them to you. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, so flair is it, and the mistress of flair is Margaret Fox, who was our star obituary writer until she retired to write fascinating novels. I think she left in 2016. Anyway, she's just beyond a pro. And I'd like to read this lead that she wrote for Barry Humphries, otherwise known as Dame Edna, the performer, the Australian performer who died last year. So here is how it begins. Opossums, Dame Edna is no more. To be unflinchingly precise, Barry Humphries, the Australian-born actor and comic who for almost 7 decades brought that divine doyenne of divadom, Dame Edna Everage, to delirious, dotty, disdainful, Dadaist life, died on Saturday in Sydney. He was 89. One more paragraph. A stiletto-heeled, stiletto-tongued persona who might well have been the spawn of a ménage à quatre involving Oscar Wilde, Salvador Dali, Auntie Mame, and Miss Piggy. Dame Edna was not so much a character as a cultural phenomenon, a force of nature trafficking in wicked, sequined commentary on the nature of fame. And by contrast, I want to read the lead of the Washington Post obit of Dame Edna. Now, the Washington Post has a fantastic obits desk. I mean, no disrespect to them, but just this is a little bit of a contrast. Here's how they led with their obit. Barry Humphries, an Australian comedian who created and embodied the lilac-coiffed, cat-eyed, bespectacled Dame Edna Everage, a character that began in the 1950s as a satire on suburbia and evolved into a global goddess of bling and irreverence who performed for British royalty and on Broadway stages, has died in a Sydney hospital at 89. Now that's pretty good. But you'll have to admit that Margot's, that's her, the name she goes under, that Margot's really sings.
Wow, that is pretty incredible. Um, and that leads me to ask, when you embark on an obituary, uh, what sort of goals do you have for each one that you do?
Well, I think, again, like all obits writers, we want to bring the person to life. We don't want to just type a resume. So it's not their awards and their jobs. It's, somehow finding, the quote, the detail that brings them to life. Um, and sometimes if you're Margaret Fox, you find that in your own just wonderful creative mind. Sometimes you can pluck it from, if they're an author, their own writing. I wanted to read also, if you'll indulge me,
Yes.
another lead from perhaps the greatest obits writer that the Times has, and he's still with us, and his name is Robert McFadden, and he's in his 80s, and now he does advances. Those are the obits that are prepared for significant individuals, heads of state, et cetera, et cetera. Every president has one. And he is also a master of the form. And I'll give you his lead to his obituary of Chita Rivera, who died this year. So here goes. To generations of musical aficionados, Ms. Rivera was a whirling, bounding, high-kicking, elemental force of the dance, a seductive singer of smoky ballads and sizzling jazz, and a propulsive actress of vaudevillian energy. And then he added later, critics thumbed thesauruses for hyperboles to rhapsodize about her pyrotechnics.
As you were talking about this, gnawing away at me, and it's sort of in the back of my mind, is I wondered if you and your colleagues at the Times are ever contacted by angry family members or friends who insist, that you got it wrong or you missed the core of who a person was or what they did.
Well, it happens rarely, thank goodness. And it has happened rarely to me, but it has hideously happened, most upsettingly, 2 weeks ago. I had written the obituary of a woman named Peggy Hitchcock, and she was a wealthy heiress who was the funder of the early acid tests of Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. And she also quite famously uh, convinced her twin brothers to give over to Leary and Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, their Millbrook mansion. And they rented it to Leary for $1 a year, and it became, this sort of legendary spot where all sorts of shenanigans went on. And Gordon Liddy famously raided the place. And the reason that we wrote her obit is that she had this, significant part in our cultural history. But her friends and her family felt that we had taken this one chapter of her life and reduced her entire life to this particular chapter, when she had lived, long after the Leary adventures of the late 60s and early 70s. She was a seeker, and she became a she became a Buddhist. She followed the Dalai Lama. She did good works, but again, the thing that made her rise, to use Obit's parlance, was this moment in psychedelic history, if you will. And I can read you some of the angry emails. Do you want to hear them?
Sure.
Okay. They were very upsetting. Hang on, let me find them. Because usually people are pretty happy, and that you feel good when a reader who doesn't know a subject writes you and says, "I never knew of this person, you brought them to life," or a family member said, "God, you really nailed it." And that makes you feel that you've done your job. All right, let me just find them. Okay. Are you ready? Ms. Green, I was appalled by your obituary on the amazing person, Peggy Hitchcock. I can only fully agree with the response from etc. You did a disservice to Peggy in every way. Your commitment to upholding the standards of integrity elapsed on your representation of Peggy's life. Shame on you. Here's another one. As a close friend of Peggy Mellon Hitchcock for nearly 50 years, as the mother of her godson, and as a guest at her family home in Canada for 24 consecutive summers, I was deeply dismayed and frankly appalled to read your obituary for her on blah, blah, blah. The tone and focus of your piece very much reflect the tabloid tradition of attracting an audience concerned mainly with lowbrow sensationalism, often with an eye toward unseemly, if not salacious, content. This was not what I would have expected from the NYT in the least, and in my opinion, the obituary did a great disservice to the memory of Miss Hitchcock. I mean, I must have received 15 of those. So that was bad. And I wrote them all, and I said, I'm so sorry you feel this way. Obviously, I have been derelict in my duty if this was your response. And I'm so terribly sorry.
Um,
It was a bad week. It was a
right.
very
So,
bad week.
simultaneously, I guess several different things occur to me. First of all, I want to salute you for having the courage to do that, because I don't think that a lot of people would. And secondly, since you reached out in good faith and expressed regret and attempted to ameliorate the feelings that people had, did it make a difference? Did people respond after? No. Okay.
No, no. I mean, I just, I wrote to everyone, and I just said as some version of, I have failed in my duty, and I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing X, but instead, so no, I write every person who writes me, regardless of what they write me. Often people quibble. I mean, yeah. So I always write people.
Wow.
Well,
Um,
you have to. I mean,
yeah. All right. Well, one of the reasons this is so interesting is that I think there is a perception, public perception, whether it's true or not, that at the New York Times, the attitude is a little bit of Mary Poppins, never apologize and never explain. So I guess that isn't always true.
Well,
Um,
I don't know how other reporters respond to their readers. I've always made it a practice to respond, even when we would get, even before the days of email, when we would get, enraged, scrawled letters through old-fashioned snail mail. It is the case now that we are being encouraged by our department heads and the masthead to really engage with our readers. So it's now pretty much company policy, but I've always done it. Um,
so, all this leads me to ask, about your own eventual, and I really hope it's eventual, um, obituary. What sort of thoughts, goals, and hopes do you have for that when the time comes?
Well, I don't I don't think I will rise to an obituary level. I don't think I would be covered, even though I am an obituarist. Um, and it's not always the case that times people are given obituaries. Many are, certainly the ones who made a big impact. Um, significant war correspondents, Daniel Ellsberg, I mean, all sorts of people. Well, anyway, um, as an example, I wrote about a colleague who I revered, who was a style department writer in the 70s and the 80s. Um, and because she did that, because she covered, you know, style is considered soft news, but what she was covering was cultural changes like um, divorce, second wave feminism, the rise in the 80s of, this sort of new Gilded Age. She covered she covered the human side of AIDS, not the medical research, but the impact on families and partners. But because it was in the style section or the style department, it was always considered a ghetto, and I had to really push to write her obituary. And I'm so glad that I did, because again, she chronicled our world for a number of decades. Just because she was a Times person, they weren't necessarily going to allow that to happen. But anyway, I don't think I'm getting an obit.
Um, you
You
know,
never know.
well, should I say we'll hope for the best?
Hope for
I
the
don't
best.
know.
I mean, theoretically, all of us will be gone, so we won't even know.
Okay, all right. I wanted to talk about Bob Dylan for a couple minutes because I think from a cultural perspective, at least it seems to me that he's the toughest possible challenge lurking out there, partly because his career has lasted so long, but also because here's a person who has uh, consistently reinvented himself. And so if he wasn't, pursuing Woody Guthrie, I mean, it seems as though he was pursuing uh, Elvis, but there was always some sort of a change or transition taking place there. So, just for the sake of argument, if Bob Dylan were to leave this Vale of Tears this week, and if you were assigned to do that obituary, could you just walk us through the various steps that you would take in the process?
I mean, first of all, I'm sure he has an advance, because I think he's 80 already, isn't he? Once you get to that stage, and also if you're a significant figure, uh, your advance is usually prepared. And because he's had so many iterations, he was a Christian, remember? He went electric at Newport. Anyway, I'm sure that advance has been written by one of our extraordinary music critics. But if God help me, there wasn't an advance and the obits desk had been wiped out, and John Perellis, our brilliant, longtime pop music critic, was in the South Pole. um what would I do? I would quickly go through all the clips of him. It would be a clip job, because it's Bob Dylan. um it would be easy to marshal contemporary voices on Dylan. I would be able to call whomever because everybody would be at the ready. It would be a very painful day. But he's a very important cultural figure, and there's reams of copy written about him. So I would be plucking from all that work, which is available in our own archives, and Rolling Stones and the LA Times and everything else, the New Yorker. Um, uh, it would be a hard grind, given that I'm not a music writer, but the work is out there to put together.
Okay.
Um,
And in that
does
same
that help? Does
connection,
that answer the question?
yes, I think
Yeah.
so.
But he's
Um,
got an advance. I promise you, he's got an advance, and they're updating it all the time.
okay, wow. Boy, that's pretty incredible. In this same connection, I guess I was also thinking about um, Neil Young, where I guess there are fewer twists and turns and not quite the same level of attention or adulation, except that he's already inspired an 800-page biography. And boy, it seems sort of overwhelming. So, are you confident that Neil Young would also have some kind of advance to build on?
Yes. Um, I don't know how old Neil Young is now. Should we look? Do you want me to look and see how
Sure.
old he is? Okay, let's just look very quickly. Sorry to go to the device, but I don't know how else to do it. I mean, usually, if you're famous, by the time you're 80, they should be working on it. Um, he's 78. I don't know. Um, but he just married Daryl Hannah, so he's got a whole new lease on life. Um, um, but yes, Neil, if he doesn't have an advance, we'll have one very shortly. I won't be writing it.
Oh, gosh. What sort of misconceptions does the public have about the work that you do and how you do it?
Well, I guess that many people don't distinguish between what are known as the paid obits. Um, they're classified ads. They are a family's announcement of their person's death. They appear in our print version in kind of tiny type. Um, Whereas the news obits, what we work on are news stories, and they're produced, by journalists on the news desk. And I think that some people don't understand the difference between that, or even understand maybe that we do news obits. I think that's really the biggest misconception. Um,
In so many areas of American life, um, in food, in fashion, in entertainment, in novels. So often there are fashions and trends and things that are hot for a while and then not so hot. Um, does that apply to obituaries also?
well, if somebody produced something that was a big deal back in the day. Um, and that trend has passed. Mary Quant, who may have invented the miniskirt and was a significant fashion designer. I mean, she's sort of a bad example, but the miniskirt was a moment. Um, 50 years ago. She's worth that. I can think of a this isn't exactly a trend, but it was a fad. It was a kind of a trend. There was a kosher baker in New York City who wanted to develop a kosher dairy substitute. And he figured out that tofu could be the base for this dairy substitute that could be a sweet, um, um, but would pass all the Parev rules, et cetera, et cetera. And so he worked with tofu and he created this thing called tofuti. And for dieting women in New York City in the early 1980s, it was all they lived on. And so it was this one moment in time. Um, I don't know if you've heard of Tofuti. Have you?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I don't know very much about it, but the name certainly rings a bell.
But it was a moment, and that moment is worth, that was that was an impact on culture at a particular time. And so that guy got an obit. I can't remember his name, Sam Roberts, who's a real pro on the obits desk and a longtime New York Times journalist wrote it. Um, so yeah, I'm trying to think of what else. I know that Margaret Fox did the guy who invented, the pink flamingo lawn ornament, which is another,
Yeah.
fad of yore. So yes, if you made a trend, no matter when that trend was, you're worth an obit.
Is there any truth to the idea or the conception that I have that on many small and medium-sized newspapers across America, the obits desk is frequently a place where um, beginning journalists are assigned, I guess, to hone their craft, or that at some other papers, being sent to the obits desk um, can actually be a punishment and a sign that you've ticked off the wrong people, or maybe that's a fantasy. Do you have any
Well, I
sense
don't
of
know
that?
about I don't know about young journalists on local papers. I don't know enough about it. The more traditional route into journalism for young people used to be when there were more local papers. Now it's a different story. Is you did, police and fire. You were on the Metro desk and you did, yeah, police and fire was your kind of breaking in period. I don't know about the obits desk. But certainly in days of yore, um, in big and small newspapers, it was the end of the road. Um, it was maybe you hadn't pissed somebody off, but you had kind of done your time, and this would be your last spot. This would be heaven's waiting room for you. I think it's less that way. Um, I know on our desk, many have asked to be on the desk. And but it is true that older reporters are often there, not as punishment, but just because I think, we're more interested in those kinds of lives. And maybe we've proved ourselves in other ways. Um, but also we just, you have the context that a younger reporter wouldn't have. Um, so in answer to your original question, sort of, yes. But I think it's less so these days. I mean, I asked to be on the obits desk. It wasn't a punishment. Or maybe it
Which
was. I don't
which
know.
leads me to ask, I mean, given um, that you had worked for so many years as a feature writer and editor, what led you to make this change?
Well, when COVID happened, one of the editors, Dan Waken, on the obits desk, decided that we would do kind of regular obits of people who died from COVID. Because in the beginning, as you'll recall, it was killing a lot of people. Um, and it was modeled over Those We've Lost, which is what the Times did for the victims of 9/11. And these were, very small obits of the people who died in the World Trade Center and also, in Washington, um, or Maryland rather. So when they decided, it was on April 1st of 2020, when they decided to do COVID obits, each feature desk had to volunteer a couple of feature writers. And we were asked to give 3 months. So I was one of the first, and I raised my hand, and after the first 3 months, I kept saying, "May I please stay?" Because I felt that the work was honorable and that it was something that I could, I felt that I was being of use during this, very trying time. And then when the year was, and then I also did regular obits amongst those COVID obits. And then when the year was up, I didn't want to go back. I was a feature writer in the style department, and I said, can I stop here? Um, because again, I felt that the work was worthwhile. You are telling history as it's been lived, and every obit is an education in, I mean, I've done neuroscientists, civil rights activists. I did a burlesque queen. I learned about couples therapy last week. I mean, I've learned about poets, artists, South American architects, the guy who restored the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Um, that's what happened to me.
I'm just curious, when you go to a party and you meet somebody for the first time and they ask you what you do professionally, what sort of reactions or responses do you get?
Well, there are two responses. One is, well, there are three actually. One is embarrassment because they feel that I'm either typing up the classified ads and, I've been punished in some way, or I've been put on the obituaries desk because I've done something wrong, as you describe. And they know I'm doing news obits, but they think I've been punished. Um, Another thing is they think that we're writing about death, and so they feel, you know, their face sort of falls. And I tell them, well, no, we write about life. And then there's another response, which is just delight, because many people are obsessed with obits. And so they have all sorts of questions.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. Um, do you ever wish that that you could get a second crack, a second chance at something that's been published and of course, now can't really be touched in any significant way?
Yes. So the obit that I just wrote, that you mentioned, was the obituary for a couples therapist whose name is Dr. Sue Johnson. She was British born, but worked in Canada. She was a clinical psychologist, and she um, kind of challenged and did away with the traditional behavioral approach to couples therapy, which is, kind of negotiating and learning to sort of modify your behavior, as you do in traditional therapy. And she began through, just studying the way her couples interacted, that what couples really wanted was the support and steadiness that, say, a child needs from a parent. And so she drew from what's called attachment theory to help couples reinforce that bond, and to also kind of acknowledge that dependence on a loved one is not something to be ashamed of. It's something that can give you not just strength in the relationship, but strength in the world. And what I regret about the obit is that I felt that I wrote it in sort of a perfunctory way, just, kind of almost using psychological jargon. It could have been, just a sort of one-off in Psychology Today. And what I felt that I had failed to do was really talk about, the nature of love, and how, to lean into how we feel about love, and also to lean into her really profoundly felt mission that love will save us as a culture. And I felt that I didn't do that. And I wish I could go back.
Wow. How many obituaries do you typically write a week, and how long do they take?
I'm very slow. I am the slowest one on the desk. I just want to say that. I do 1 to 2 a week, because it takes me 3 days, unless it's a deadline obit, unless it's somebody I have to get up fast, in which case I do it in a day. Everyone else on the desk can write 3 a week. Some of them, it takes them a day because they're extraordinary. I'm a little slower.
Okay. And once you've done what you're going to do to produce an obituary, is there an editor who reviews it before it's published?
Oh my goodness, yes, we have a huge bench of editors. They're incredibly skilled. They're all experienced Times editors. Our leader is Bill McDonald, who's been there for at least a decade. If anybody watched the wonderful documentary about our Obits desk called Obit, he is featured in that. And he's an extraordinarily elegant editor who was culture editor back in the day. And his team is extraordinary. And I mean, they just make us better. They make what we do sing.
Okay.
And they save us from terrible mistakes. Terrible mistakes.
Can you give me an example?
Well, a dumb mistake is math. So, so, just a very simple example is, somebody was born on X date and they die on Y date, and, their birth month is, Z month. And I will write that they have died, I'll say that they were 89 when in fact they were 88 because they hadn't quite turned. And, an editor is smart enough to know math. Um, and then just inelegancies. Um, if you're using a cliche, they'll call you out on your cliche. Um, Yesterday I had something bad where I had said that, you know, I had written something like weathering the weeds of a relationship, and it was sort of two cliches in one. And the editor was smart enough to say, if you're going to use a cliche, can you make it parallel, weather the storm, you know? Um, and they make, they are um, artists really, and we all are grateful for what they do.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for being so incredibly gracious. And, now that I've had my shot, I think it's only fair to give our audience members, particularly those who hung in there, at some very difficult moments, a chance to ask questions too. So I'm going to go into the chat now and take my glasses off. All right. So, um, so we have an initial acknowledgement that's just a thank you. And then Janet Kroll says, Times obits among my favorite reads, perhaps to realize how insignificant one's own story is.
That's how I
Longtime subscriber, 1958. Many old friends were employees, now departed. Dick Madden, editor of the Connecticut edition. All right. So one of our audience members asks anonymously, out of all the individuals that you've profiled, who left the most lasting impression on you and why?
That's a great question. And I'm going to find my person. One of the people whose life and death moved me the most was an artist named Julie Green, and she for more than a decade painted on ceramic plates with blue glaze so that they looked like sort of the traditional, plate, the last meals of death row inmates. And it was her way of humanizing them. And it was also this very gentle but incredibly profound um, piece of activism that she was going to do until the death penalty was eliminated, and she died of ovarian cancer before that happened. And I'd just like to read you a little bit from that obituary. Is that okay? Hang
Yes.
on. Let me just find it, because it really, I just, all right, here's how we started. 6 tacos, 6 glazed donuts, and a cherry Coke. That was the last meal of a man executed in Oklahoma in July 1999. Rendered in cobalt blue glaze on a white china plate the next year, it was the first in Julie Green's decades-long art project, The Last Supper, which documented the final meals of death row prisoners around the country. Um, she had read about, in this is another local paper thing, and maybe they don't do it anymore because, again, the death of local papers, there used to be the convention where they would note the last meal. And she just was blown away by that fact and began to cover this. Um, she completed her 1000th plate. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola. It was requested by a Texas man in 1997. And she actually died by assisted suicide because she had ovarian cancer. She lived in Oregon, and she died a couple of weeks later. Um, and it was just the specificity and the mundanity, um, uh, of these men's. They were all men. There was a guy who asked for 2 peanut butter cups and a Dr. Pepper. Anyway, I would have to say she was the most moving.
Jim asks, who at the New York Times writes advances for famous folks?
Oh, well, we all have to do a couple. We all have a list. Um, but the two who are dedicated to that, are Robert McFadden, who is he's a Pulitzer Prize winning famous New York Times reporter, who's known as the rewrite guy. He was the guy, when war broke out or a plane crashed, he would marshal all the reports, of the reporters from around the world and produce, the front page heartbreaking story of, whatever tragedy. But he is also the guy who writes every president's, um, obituary. He does all the significant advances, as does Margot Fox. Um, and I read you a little bit of one of his advances. He had done Cheetah Rivera's. But we all have to do them. Um, and and they're delightful. It can be not complicated, but difficult to keep yourself to, kind of a normal newspaper length. I mean, McFadden, when he does a president, will do 10,000 words, but we're really only allowed 15 to 1700. And often we meet our advanced subjects, or at least participate, or at least get them on the phone. And then it's, um, you feel that you've done them a disservice if you render them. Anyway, um, McFadden is the master, but we all do them.
I I shouldn't interject, but I can't help myself. I have to ask, um, do people ever, for whatever reason, say, no, I don't want to cooperate in preparing an advance on me. I don't want to be involved.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how McFadden does it. I think pretty much his people are so significant, they know that he's going to be calling. And so, that's that. Um, Henry Kissinger participated in his advance, and forgive me, I can't remember who his obituarist was. Um, but it was a long process of interviews. When I have done advances, I have figured out someone to reach out to gently suggest or ask if the person would want to participate. And in many cases, their dear friend or family member has said, they really wouldn't. So let's not talk to them. And in other cases, it's often women. In other cases, the person close to my person has said, yes, call her up. So it just depends.
Um, Eddie Shepson says, what criteria does the New York Times use to determine who is sufficiently newsworthy for a life story after the person's passing?
Well, it's again, they've had to have made an impact on the culture in some way. Um, and in in the old days, they would have had to have had a mention in the New York Times. It's no longer that way. Um, I'm just thinking of a woman, Catherine Burks Brooke, who was a freedom writer, uh, in the late 60s, um, who, she was a 21-year-old student, and she got on a bus with and a whole bunch of freedom riders, and they, rode through Mississippi and Alabama at great peril to themselves. She stood up to a notorious sheriff, who murdered people, murdered Black people, and she was an African American child, a 21-year-old college student, and she stood up to him, and he had tried to get them out of his county and threw them, delivered them to the state line. And she said to him, we'll see you back in wherever it was, Selma, at noon. And they made their way back, and they lived. And she was not, that moment wasn't, so well reported, um, at least not on a national level. But what she did was extraordinary. And so we were grateful to have learned about her through somebody who did a series of the mugshots of freedom riders. It's called I can't remember the name of the book. It's called Breach of Peace, which was what they were all, charged with and thrown in jail. Anyway, so that's just a long way of saying there are many, many ways of making a mark on our culture, and they don't have to be news stories. And what we're trying to do going forward is invite the public to let us know about individuals that they think we should be covering. There is a form that you can fill out, and we're really trying hard to uh, broaden our scope, to note lives that may not have been heralded, even though they were worth heralding for whatever it was that they did.
Earlier in this conversation, you talked about the fact that uh, completely apart from the work that you do, um, ordinary Americans, I mean, if they want to have a paid death notice in the New York Times, certainly can do so. So one audience member asks why those small text obituary notices have become so long in recent years.
They cost $1 million a line. I have no idea why they're so long. Because literally, I can't remember how much it is a word or a character. They're so expensive. That's a question I can't answer. I don't know the answer.
All right, and this next thing is a comment. It's not a question, but I think it's so interesting and important and relevant to what we've been talking about that I just like to read this comment from Joe Friedman, who says, I believe the obituaries are the most accurate and best written feature of the New York Times. Most satisfying to me are reading about people who are not well known, but had decisive influence. Several years ago, I read an obituary for a Soviet military figure who had to decide whether an event on screen was an incoming American plane or missile, and by deferring judgment, prevented a war.
Amazing. That's amazing.
So.
I mean, I'm not familiar with the obit, but it's amazing. And I note that he's continued and said, does the Times make a special effort to research figures and survivors from World War II? I don't know the answer in particular. One of our reporters, the amazing Clay Reason, is an historian, particularly of that period. So I'm gonna make this up and say yes, and say he's the guy.
Okay. Um, Mary Frankel says, several years ago, I saw a wonderful documentary about the New York Times obit department. One of the unexpected comments I heard was that the obit writers would research their columns in part by going into small rooms packed with filing cabinets, searching information from newspapers that had been clipped and saved for when an obit would be written. Do those filing cabinets still exist?
It's the morgue. It's called the morgue. And it's a magical, magical place. And it used to be in the basement of our old building on Times Square on West 43rd Street. And when we moved to our new building on 40th near Port Authority, it's in a building next door, still in the basement, and it's still overseen by the extraordinary Jeff Roth, who is a researcher extraordinaire. And if it is Aladdin's cave, and it's, chock-a-block with filing cabinets, with clippings from, the 1940s and scans of books, and you can't even imagine what's down there. It is a magical place, and Jeff will give you a tour should you come to New York and want to see it. And I can figure out with Dick, if anybody does that, how we can set that up. It's an extraordinary place. We don't use it so much anymore. I mean, many of us work remotely, and as time progresses, there's more and more that's archived. For example, our all of everything in the New York Times has been digitally archived, back to the turn of the 20th century. So it's not necessary to have those yellowing clips, but they still exist.
Okay. Um, Beatrice says and asks, I know that my work has influenced some aspects of my personal life. How has your work influenced your life?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm going to have to think about it. Um, Earlier, somebody noted that reading obituaries made her think, God, what would somebody write about my life? Or I don't think she put it that way. I haven't lived sort of fully as these obituary subjects have. So I often feel that way and think, God, I really haven't done anything with my life. Um, yeah, I think that's really the only, it just makes me feel, that I better hop to if I want to make, I don't know, do some good.
Okay. Uh, I Here's something I can't resist. An anonymous audience member
Oh, I
says,
think this one, yeah.
is there a prohibition to not writing an obituary of a very famous person because what he was famous for was so evil and terrible?
Absolutely not. We just did, Clay did it. Clay just wrote the obituary of Andrew Crispo, who was a gallerist in New York City in the 60s and, sorry, in the 70s and 80s, who tortured and murdered somebody. So he was a heinous, evil person, and he did receive an obit because he was a significant figure.
All right. And someone asks, are obit writers ever sued for incorrect information?
Um, no, I mean, the time you can't, well, I mean, people often try and sue the New York Times and its reporters. Um, we have an extraordinary legal team who handles that. So, we wouldn't be libel, it's really the Times, but no, nobody's ever sued. If information is incorrect, we correct it. And we note at the bottom of the story online, what the incorrect information was in the original version, and when it was corrected and what it was corrected to. So we don't allow incorrect information to stand if we know that we've done it. If somebody lets us know that we've made an error, it's always corrected.
Okay. So I wanted to ask about people who are, um, the leaders of Hamas or Hezbollah, people who purposely, to survive, I guess, are uh, shadowy people who really rely on mystery and misdirection to survive. It would seem to be, impossible or almost impossible to ferret out the real facts about their lives. Or am I simply wrong about that?
Well, I'm not a foreign correspondent, so I can't speak to that. I mean, just I kind of know as a reader that the beat reporters are pretty well schooled in their topics. And if, ex leader of Hamas were to be killed, whomever it is, and forgive me for not recalling, who, because I actually have heard who does cover them. But whoever that is, it's a male journalist, he would be able to produce a proper obituary.
All right. And I think to end today, um, I picked a question by someone Gwen Haven, who is currently a student at Temple University, who says, Ms. Green, as a student at Temple University striving to improve my writing, I often find it challenging to balance flair with conciseness. Given your extensive experience as a feature writer and editor, what strategies would you recommend for making writing more engaging while also keeping it concise?
I don't think I can speak to the craft of it. I think the method is reading, and I think it's reading how others do it. And I think a really good place to do that is to read the obituaries of the good newspapers. The English newspapers, the Philly newspapers are fantastic. I think we're pretty good. I think the Washington Post is terrific and the LA Times is terrific, because that's exactly what an obit is. It's just the facts with some flair. And I think, the reading will give you um, reading will help. I don't know that I could articulate how to construct your sentences. I think you look at how others construct their sentences and how they put together their paragraphs. Um, and the obits desk is a good place to look for it.
Okay.
Look for McFadden's byline, look for Sam Roberts's byline, look for Clay Reason's, look for all my colleagues' bylines, because they're really good.
Okay. I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. I want to thank you for being so extraordinarily generous with your time and honest about some things I think that others would have covered up, and simply for being so good humored about some of the technical problems that we had. So thank you so much. I really
Oh,
am grateful.
it's my pleasure. Obits are my favorite subject. So thank you so much for having me.